It's time now for the Success is Subjective podcast. Here is your host and therapeutic consultant for young adults only, Joanna Lilley.
Hi, and welcome to the show. I know the anxiety that comes from watching a loved one struggle with a non-linear path. This podcast was created to fight back against the narrow picture of success painted by social media. Each week, we share authentic stories from people who changed course, failed, and ultimately found their own definition of success. These are the stories you need to hear to prove that changing your mind is common, and you don't have to have it all figured out at 18. If you're a parent or a young adult looking for a little proof, you're home. Now, let's get into today's episode. If you'd like to explore how I can help your young adult, schedule a free consultation through my website link in the show notes. Today, my guest is Tom Bannard. Tom is the Assistant Director for Substance Use and Recovery Support at Virginia Commonwealth University, otherwise known as VCU. A person in long-term recovery, Tom is passionate about changing the way we treat substance use and firmly believes that we must improve our systems of care by focusing on long-term recovery supports, allowing easier access to treatment and recovery resources, educating and supporting family members, and reducing stigma around substance use. Tom directs RAMS in Recovery, which is the largest collegiate recovery program in the state of Virginia, and oversees an expansion grant through the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services to expand recovery supports at 9 other institutions in the Commonwealth. Before I wrap up this interview, or the intro rather, I have to give a shout out to Cameron Can for making this connection. Now, Cam and I have talked about collegiate recovery in the past ad nauseum, like which schools have them, how they differ, and the ever-evolving conversation with parents about returning to school post-treatment, which if you ever listen to Cam's interview, you definitely want to check that out because he talks about it for himself as well. Definitely stick around to listen to the entire interview, as Tom and I actually go a little bit off script after he finishes talking about his own journey, so we can talk about the differences in collegiate recovery programs and then how families can determine when it's time to return to campus and whether or not a young adult or student is ready to engage in the collegiate recovery community on a particular campus. This is especially relevant because I feel like this conversation never gets old with the clients that I work with and the families that I'm in communication with, as this is and will continue to be an ongoing issue for those, especially young people who have just started a life in recovery. So I'm forever grateful for Tom for being a guest. I'm going to wrap up this intro. Let's just jump in. Here is Tom. All right, Tom, I'm excited to have you on the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's just jump in because we were connected by a mutual colleague who I don't even know actually your connection with him,
Sure.
But we might get to that maybe, so we can do like a little shout out. Regardless, why don't you tell our listeners, where did you grow up and what was the messaging that you were getting about what you're supposed to do after high school?
Sure. So I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. We moved here when I was 5 and I live here now. And I went to a private school, kind of pretty intense environment, very high expectations, excellent education. And I think, the messages were, you go to college and you get a degree or more, and then you work and kind of produce for society. I think that more from my parents, there was kind of an expectation of that you do something that has a positive impact on the world. I think the school, it was a little bit more like you work and you produce and you create, value for society, like maybe a little bit more of a kind of monetary focus. At least that's where most of my kind of classmates ended up. Though I ended up going to boarding school and in Massachusetts, and that was a very high, even higher pressure environment, really high expectations of folks, and a real kind of focus on service to the world as well. And so, but it was kind of, there was no doubt that you were supposed to go to a 4-year school, that all kind of remained consistent. You were supposed to work hard. You could take a gap year and do something wild, but then
Yeah.
you had some real expectations.
But then you still have to circle back, right? You still gotta go. You still gotta get that 4-year degree. Okay, so then what? Now that you're getting all of these messages, what did you end up doing?
Yeah, so I went to a 4-year school. Went to UVA up the road here, and kind of was on that path. So my parents were teachers, and I was kind of studying history and African American studies, and I wanted to be a history teacher. And kind of pretty early on, probably started a little bit before that, my addiction, my substance use kind of had started to take off, and I was still kind of achieving well enough to keep people off my back, but substance use was becoming a larger and larger part of kind of my world, and my addiction had, I was using substances daily, alcohol, amphetamines, cannabis, and really heavily, and kind of had built my world around that. Started selling drugs, mostly to support my own use, but also kind of more support my lifestyle. Didn't really need the money that much, but there were some perks and some lifestyle that came from that, and I was just so embedded in that culture. And then it all blew up. I got into a whole bunch of trouble, legal trouble, physical danger, things kind of happening connected to my addiction, that I think I was really fortunate that most of my consequences happened in a very short period of time. And I had this oh, you got to look at this thing. This thing is going to prevent anything else from being possible if you don't focus on this thing. And so kind of at that point, called my parents, and was able to kind of get into treatment, and so took a totally different route from there.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I'm just picturing too, this is our first time ever meeting, but I'm I do know that you're not a history teacher. So I at least know that at some point we're going to get to what it is that you're doing now. But okay, so you reached out to your parents. It all kind of came to a head, or quickly in quick succession. A lot of consequences are rolling out. You reach out to your parents, you ask for help. What ends up, where did life take you at that point?
Sure. So I went to treatment. I ended up being really fortunate, because at that time, it's 2006, we didn't have mental health parity. There wasn't, a broad treatment available for most people. We were financially situated. My parents were, that they could help me help with treatment. And so I ended up going to really high quality care. And at that point, I thought, well, everything's going to work out. We're just going to get right back on track. I thought that the charges would go away. I thought I'd get my old job back, kind of all this kind of stuff. And that stuff didn't work out. I ended up having a felony conviction. So my old job was at a school, so I couldn't do that. I couldn't, there's not a big market for, entry level history teachers with felony convictions. And so I really had to switch gears. And I think my first couple of years, I was really focused on my recovery, but I also, had a sense of this could be something, this could be a space to work in. And so I ended up going back to school. I did finish my kind of history degree, but also went back to school for addictions counseling, and started working in that space. 2008, I was starting to work in that space.
Wow.
So
okay.
It happened pretty quickly.
So I'm going to round up. We're talking about almost 20 years ago. And so Sure. You're working in the treatment space. What were you doing? Again, maybe let me back up. Here's what I want to do, because I do want to make sure that we have an opportunity to really put a spotlight on what it is that you're doing now, where you
Sure.
are, the work that you're doing, because I get a lot of families that are asking specifically about kind of the lane in which you work, which Sure. is awesome. And I still want to make sure that I'm giving enough time and space for you to be able to kind of demonstrate the journey that you were on leading to where you are now. So walk us through that.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple different things kind of happened. And I think there was a lot of kind of confluence of, good fortune and events and that sort of thing. I was pretty serious about recovery. When I went back to my undergraduate, UVA happened to be one of kind of 4 schools in the country that had support for students in recovery, had a collegiate recovery program. It's very small, but it kind of gave me this instant network of folks in recovery. And it was really beneficial. It helped me. I didn't have much time left at VCU, so it helped me kind of get into that and be successful in that semester. I lived with family when I was there that semester, so there was some protection there. And then I was kind of like, what do I do next? And so I had to do an internship because I was kind of in parallel doing this addictions counseling certification. And I did an internship at a place called The Healing Place, which is a long-term recovery program for, at that time, just homeless men. And so, I just kind of got thrown into the fire there and just started learning a whole lot about that space. And kind of that organization was connected to another organization called Caritas. And I ended up working at that organization for 7 years, doing a whole bunch of different things, mostly connected to addiction recovery, but also kind of doing some fundraising things, doing IT. It was pretty interesting because, when you're at a small nonprofit that's just like trying to survive, if you're competent, you're just going to be asked to do stuff. And I was fairly competent. And so I got to do a bunch of stuff and help in a bunch of different areas and got really great experience at a wonderful organization. And then kind of happenstance, I was at a kind of retreat one time, and I just met this person. I was kind of having a hard time interpersonally with some things at the time. And this kind of really kind older lady kind of walked up to me and talked to me, and we talked for a while and didn't know who she was. Well, it turned out her name was Kitty Harris, and she's kind of the grandmother of collegiate recovery. And I got home and she sent me all this literature on this like growing collegiate recovery movement, which I had been exposed to in my undergrad and had been helpful. And it was cool. So it was this cool happenstance. And I met somebody that was wonderful, Linda Hancock at Virginia Commonwealth University. And she said, we really want to have a collegiate recovery program here. And I was like, well, let me see what I can do to help you with that. And got this kind of small group of people together and started trying to figure out what that could be like. And ended up getting hired as kind of the first coordinator in 2015 after volunteering for a couple of years. And it's just been kind of fabulous. I've been here at Virginia Commonwealth University since then, working with students in recovery and kind of growing both that program at our university, but also working with students across the state and staff across the state to kind of grow these kind of types of supports for students, for not just young people, but people in recovery that are trying to get a degree in higher education.
Yeah. Okay, so just in the off chance that somebody's listening to this and they're like, what the heck is collegiate recovery?
Sure.
Or like you talk about services, can you just like shed a little bit of light on what that could potentially look like for a student that might be, and obviously use that reference for VCU. If a student's looking at VCU right now and they're like coming out of treatment and they're like, I might need to be connected to the collegiate recovery program, what does that mean?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing to know, and people, this is not a big stretch for folks, is that college campuses, generally speaking, are hostile environments for people navigating substance use disorders or early recovery. And, I don't have to do a lot of explaining to that. Substance use is endemic on college campuses. The use is higher than, peers that are not at a university. There's cultural support basically for substance use. And so when folks are kind of coming back to school or trying to get into recovery while they're at a university or a college, it's really hard. And most of the substance use services at colleges and universities are really structured around short-term, kind of minimal interventions, because frankly, that's what most people on college campuses that struggle have, kind of minor issues, right? Relatively minor issues. They might have high immediate risk, but they're not these kind of longer term issues. And collegiate recovery really focuses on these students that have severe substance use disorders, where folks have just been hugely impacted by their substance use. And really, it's kind of, I describe it as a deep, not wide service, right? So we're not trying to serve the whole campus. We're trying to serve a very specific group of students that are either really, really struggling with their active use, or have started to resolve an issue with substances, or have resolved an issue with substances, and how do we help those students thrive? And so I think it's really important for parents to kind of know that, for families to know that these services are actually not available at the vast majority of schools. And there's a huge variation in kind of the quality and the depth of what the services are. And so it's just because a university has alcohol, other drug services, doesn't mean that they have collegiate recovery support. It doesn't mean that they really know what recovery support means. And so it's a real area that's worth kind of doing a deeper dive, whether that's somebody that's kind of dropped out of a school thinking about going back there, or I want a fresh start somewhere else. It really makes a huge difference to have this really dedicated interpersonal support. And so what I think about as just basics is there should be a staff person that is dedicated to collegiate recovery, preferably a full-time person. And there should be a physical space at the school, a clubhouse, a gathering space. Students should be able to show up there and see other students in recovery and say, oh, I'm not alone here. Because that's often what students will say is, I think I'm the only person that has this experience. All my friends are not doing this. And for the most part, our students in recovery, they're not that interested in the significant number of students on our campuses that are not using substances. They're not that interested a lot of times in the board game club or the, kind of some of these other areas. Like some of the reasons that they develop substance use disorders in the first place is because they're risk takers. They're kind of, folks that want to be out there. They're very, social. So while there's some wonderful movements around substance-free activities on many of our campuses, it really is not quite the same thing as having real recovery support and being able to walk in somewhere and say, yeah, I get that. I've had that experience. A lot of staff people are like me. They've, had serious substance use disorders. They work from a space of lived experience. And so, folks don't feel alone. And that's the first step. And then from there, we do a lot of work to convince students that their kind of recovery is not a liability. It's this tremendous asset. It's a superpower. And our kind of data from students that participate in our programs really shows that to be the case, that students in our program have very high GPAs, higher than the general population. They are retained in school. They go on and do really cool things. Unsurprisingly, lots of them end up working in behavioral health. They just find this different level of purpose, and they engage with their universities in a very different way than certainly before they as they were struggling with their addiction, but even then the average student, because they develop these skills in recovery that are, asking for help. They go to office hours, they do these kinds of things when they are supported, when they have this place to fall back on to say, yeah, my professor talked about, everybody going out and drinking afterwards. It didn't feel very good. It's like, well, okay, that's different if you're supported than if you're unsupported. Yeah. And when other students can say, yeah, I've had that professor too. So that's the kinds of things that are available generally, and the experiences that we're trying to support students having. And I can talk more about the specific services as well, if that would be helpful.
I think, well, let me ask a different question, and then maybe we'll get back to it organically, but just for the sake of time, right? So you did, right before you answered that question, because I went a little off script, you mentioned that you've been in this position at VCU for now 10 years, essentially. Like, this is a long-standing position, and clearly you, like you said, you have your own lived experience, so your focus and vision is helping other students that are showing up, wanting that connection. So having heard your own personal story leading up to what it is that you're doing now and what you've been doing for the last 10 years, do you see yourself as successful?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel really good about the program we've built. We went from having no staff to having half-time staff. We have 4 full-time staff, and student staff. Our team is 16 people now that are doing not just kind of direct support for students in recovery, but implementing things across our campus in terms of naloxone training and education around substance use disorders and kind of various outreach activities. And it's been tremendously rewarding work to work in this space and to be of service. And there wasn't a lot of kind of professional development from a perspective of recovery for me early on in my career. And so really providing a kind of really nurturing environment for this kind of next generation of substance use professionals is extremely rewarding. And, certainly not in it for the money, right? And I have enough distance and skills and experience from kind of the thing that got me here that I certainly could do other things. And I just don't desire to do that. I've really enjoyed building this. It's wonderful to be at a university. It's wonderful to kind of be able to break through some of the stigma that folks experience, and just really feel like I'm living in a way that's true to my values and frankly true to the way that I was raised in terms of what my parents and family said was important.
Yeah, it's funny how that always comes back full circle, right? You're like, okay, the vision was being an educator, and you are an educator. Yeah. You happen to be kind of educating on a different topic at this point. So the service piece is still there. I want to circle back. Why don't you just maybe what are some 5 common services that a student that's exploring a potential university, knowing that there's a collegiate recovery community, what might they find? And then I have one wrap up question that I think I think you're going to like this one.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So kind of our core services are, so we provide individual recovery coaching. So, that varies if somebody is brand new to recovery, not sure if they want to be in recovery. That's one set of coaching kind of goals, and another set when it's somebody's later on in their journey and they're trying to navigate career things and that sort of thing. We have, and this is not unheard of at other places, but we're one of the few places that have a really robust program. We have what's called our Recovery Scholars Program. And so that's a scholarship that is linked to a weekly supportive space. And it's a model from Texas Tech. And we're actually able to serve students across Virginia with that program. So we have more than 100 students in that program. There's kind of 10 different sections of that. So people have a lot of choices. And it's a small cohort of folks that are all in recovery, all doing the same kinds of things that, work on various things over the course of a semester. And then they might be in a different seminar the next semester, but it allows support throughout their time. And so that's a signature program for us. We do a lot of traveling with our students. So we do at least 5 trips a year. So, we don't get into recovery to drop out of life. So, it's really important that we learn to have fun in recovery. So we take students on a lot of trips. We do at least 5 trips a year. We do a recovery spring break trip. And so that just builds community across our students. And that's really awesome. And then kind of the other set of services is really about outreach across campus. So kind of making a positive impact from availability of naloxone to recovery ally training, how do faculty and staff and students support their loved ones as far as their recovery. So we really enjoy doing that work and having that kind of impact.
I'm just sitting here totally geeking out on, I went to college a very long time ago. And so this kind of stuff just didn't really exist. And to your point, it was Texas Tech, that was it. That was the mothership. And then at some point, other colleges started to doing things. But now in 2026, it's just so cool to see what some colleges, like you said, not all, but some are actually offering and providing, not just for the community to educate and raise awareness around substance use, but also to provide services and support for the students that are choosing to be in recovery, because it is a choice. And sometimes that's a really hard choice, especially when you're in this like very young developing brain period in your life going, wait, I'm making this choice forever, right? Or if they're still contemplative, I'm not sure. Okay, that's really common, but like to still be able to have a clubhouse that you can go to, or a scholarship program you can apply for, or a sober, fun spring break, like those things, that's just rad to hear. Okay, so here's my question in rapid fire. I get asked all the time by parents, and I'm so curious to hear what you have to say, where they're like, hey, my, insert gender of a young adult, they took off the fall semester because they needed to focus on their treatment, but we have to get them back on campus in the spring. Yeah, you're laughing because I'm sure you know where this is going. I always struggle as a consultant where I'm trying to explain to parents the benefit of taking time off of school just a little bit longer to lay the foundation for their recovery, to then have them in a different headspace when they are actually back on campus, whether it's returning to the same school or going somewhere else. And so I'm curious for you, as somebody who is a program coordinator for a collegiate recovery program at a prestigious 4-year school, how do you respond to that, or what would you advise for parents that might be in that kind of vacillated space of, we got to hurry up and get back on campus, and maybe they're missing the mark around what's actually important for the student?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, like my grad school taught me, it depends is probably the answer that I would go with. I think it's important to understand about collegiate recovery programs is that for the most part, they're not clinical services, with kind of the exception of Augsburg, that you're not sending somebody into this situation where they're going to be highly monitored like they might have been in a treatment environment, right? So everything is optional. People are opting in to do these things. And so depending on the kind of maturity level of the individual, that could be great. They could hit the ground running and just be really plugged in. And if they're really on fire about their recovery, if they go to a school, and this is the big if, they go to a school with robust recovery supports and they go in with kind of a connection to that, and there's clearly a program there with a community there, that can be a great situation, right? And it's a way to kind of accelerate the momentum that they might have gotten a little bit of out of their out of their treatment experience. And so we often will have folks in that kind of situation that do thrive and do really well, but that's not everybody coming out of treatment, especially with young adults. And so I think making some really realistic assessments of both what's the environment that somebody is going back into, and listening to some clinical advice, of course, but really your kids. So it's you really knowing your kids and saying, is this person in a place where they have a maturity to do this, because this is not a joke. And what I say to administrators, for example, about collegiate recovery programs, administrators at schools that don't really have support, who are often concerned about the liability of having such a program, I say, you've got this all wrong. You are not taking a risk on these students. These students are taking a risk coming to schools that are unprepared to support them, right? They are risking their lives, okay? And so I think that understanding on an individual basis, okay, like what is the real risk level of what's going on with my loved one? What's the maturity they're demonstrating and their commitment to what they're doing? And then what are the supports that are going to be in place for them at the school? Really taking those different pieces and really thinking hard about those things before being kind of pushed by this timeline that might have been your timeline or might be the societal timeline, but it doesn't need to be your loved one's timeline.
Tom, thank you so much for not just showing up and sharing your story, but doing the work that you're doing, because it is so important, and for going off script at the very end, answering a very specific question that I often get asked, or maybe it's not a question per se, but it is just like this this decision that feels very weighted, and it is very hard sometimes for families to make that decision. And I love how you just said, it really just depends. So with that said, thank you again so much for carving out time, being a guest on the podcast, and thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's Success is Subjective episode. We want to thank our guests for joining Joanna on the show this week and for being willing to share your journey. This podcast would not exist if it weren't for people such as yourself. Stay tuned for our next episode, where you can bet it'll be another amazing human sharing their personal story with the world. Make sure you check out the show notes, where you will find contact information, website details, and all social media for our guest. If you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, you can email joanna@lilleyconsulting.com. Be sure to check out the lilleyconsulting.com website for additional resources outside of podcasting. Now, if you're listening to the show on Apple Podcasts, please subscribe. And while you're at it, feel free to leave a review. You can also download to listen to the Success is Subjective podcast on other popular podcast apps, such as Audible, Google Podcast, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn Radio. Thanks again for listening in, and remember, there is no single path through life. Success is what you make it.